They told us he was coming to confirm our victory, that his presence was benediction, not judgment. We believed this because we had been taught that Primarchs were terrible only to the Emperor's enemies, and the war was already over. I was assigned to transcribe his words during the final attestation. I thought I was documenting closure. I did not understand that closure, for a Primarch, means something very different than it does for us. The basilica had been sanitized 3 times before we were permitted entry. I could still smell the promethium beneath the incense, not the smoke of battle, but the methodical erasure that followed it. The compliance audit had already been declared successful. Population resistance indices had fallen to acceptable minimums. Tithe projections indicated structural viability for the next 70 years. My presence, as an administratum compliance scribe attached to the 47th Expeditionary Fleet, existed solely to transcribe the final attestations into permanent record. The war was over. What remained was documentation. The Basilica's original function had been civic, some planetary governance structure whose iconography had been removed with precision that spoke of legion thoroughness. Aquilus now occupied every arch, each one identical in dimension and placement. The floor was polished stone, cold enough that I felt it through regulation footwear. My transcription station had been positioned in an alcove that offered clear sightlines to the central dais while maintaining appropriate distance from the primary proceedings. I was not a participant. I was an instrument of record. 6 officials knelt in a precise semicircle before the dais. Their restraints were not chains but ceremonial bindings, white cord treated with sanctified oils, wound according to patterns I recognized from compliance protocols. These were not prisoners in the conventional sense. They had been selected as representatives, though the selection criteria had not been disclosed in my briefing documents. I assumed they were planetary governors, military commanders, administrative chiefs, individuals whose attestations would carry systemic weight. The documentation process required witnesses of appropriate rank. My equipment included a recording slate, a backup Vox capture unit, and a standard-issue chrono synchronized to fleet timekeeping. The ritual was scheduled to commence at precisely 1400 hours. I arrived at 1345, as protocol demanded. The basilica was already sealed. I noticed this not through any dramatic mechanism, but through the absence of atmospheric exchange. The air had the particular stillness of hermetic enclosure. Ventilation continued, but no external circulation disturbed the incense patterns. I reviewed my instructions while I waited. Transcribe all verbal pronouncements. Note pauses exceeding 3 seconds. Record any requests for clemency, confession, or clarification. Maintain observational neutrality. Do not interpret. Do not summarize. Accuracy was sacred. Opinion was contamination. I had performed similar duties across 11 compliance actions. This was routine, elevated by the presence of greater authority, nothing more. The chrono reached 13:58. 2 minutes remained. I activated my recording slate and performed the ritual equipment verification. Data integrity confirmed, power reserves at maximum, transmission buffers cleared. My hands moved through the sequences automatically. I had done this so many times that thought was unnecessary. Compliance work demanded repetition until action became reflex. Error emerged from thinking, not from procedure. At 13:59, the chamber's acoustic properties changed. I felt it as a pressure shift, subtle but distinct, like the moment before a storm. The bound officials remained motionless. None of them turned toward the sealed entrance. None of them showed signs of anticipation or dread. They simply waited, positioned exactly as they had been placed, their breathing synchronized in a way that suggested prior conditioning. The chrono displayed 1400 hours. The seal released without sound. My attention moved toward the entrance not through choice but through physiological compulsion. The light changed first, a subtle alteration in shadow angles that preceded any visible movement. Then the temperature dropped, not dramatically but measurably, the kind of shift that bypassed conscious awareness and triggered deeper biological responses. He entered alone. I had seen Primarchs before, but only in approved pictorial records and devotional engravings. The catechisms described them as the Emperor's perfected sons, demigods of war, terrible in their righteousness. These descriptions were not metaphors. They were inadequate technical specifications attempting to quantify something that existed beyond standard measurement. The first thing I noticed was proportion. He was large, certainly, but size alone did not capture the wrongness of his presence. Every human I had ever encountered existed within predictable physical parameters, variations in height and build, but always recognizable as human. He did not. The ratios were incorrect in ways my mind struggled to process. His shoulders were too broad for any skeletal structure I understood. His hands, visible at his sides, possessed an additional joint that should not have been possible. When he moved, there was no wasted motion, no adjustment, no compensation for weight or balance. He simply was, and space accommodated him. I began transcription automatically. My hands moved across the recording slate while my conscious mind remained occupied with processing his presence. This was training, asserting itself the devotion to duty that superseded shock or fear. I noted the timestamp, the environmental conditions, the number of witnesses present. I prepared to record his words with absolute fidelity. He approached the kneeling officials with footsteps that made no sound, not silence as absence, but silence as intentional erasure, as if sound itself chose not to exist in proximity to his movement. He stopped precisely 3 meters from the semicircle. The distance was exact. Nothing about his positioning suggested approximation or casualness. Every element of his presence existed in relationship to calculated purpose. When he spoke, I understood immediately that transcription would be more complex than anticipated. His voice carried no emotion, no emphasis, no variation in tone. Each word was delivered with identical weight and clarity. This was not speech as communication, but speech as verdict. Each syllable, a completed judgment that required no response or interpretation. Torven Matthias. He was looking at the first official. You maintained supply records for the Western Continent's agricultural distribution network. 12% of recorded grain yield was diverted to unauthorized storage facilities over a period of 8 years. This diversion enabled localized hoarding structures that delayed compliance enforcement by 9 months. Continuation of your administrative function represents systemic risk. The official Torven Matthias made a sound that my transcription protocols categorized as involuntary vocalization, not speech, not protest. The sound emerged without his apparent consent, drawn out by some mechanism I could not identify. Blood appeared at his left nostril, a thin line that tracked down across his lip. He had not been struck. No physical contact had occurred. Yet his body was responding to something, some pressure or frequency that bypassed conventional harm. I recorded the Primarch's words exactly as spoken. I noted the physiological response in clinical terminology. My training had prepared me for violence, for executions, for the full spectrum of imperial justice. This was none of those things. This was evaluation delivered with such precision that the body understood verdict before the mind could process language. Helara Kain, the second official, a woman whose ceremonial binding included additional elements I recognized as markers of medical or technical specialization. You supervised water purification protocols for the Eastern Seaboard. You implemented efficiency modifications that reduced processing stages from 9 to 6. This modification increased throughput by 17%, while introducing contaminant thresholds that exceeded acceptable margins by 0.03%. Projected mortality impact across 20 years totals 4,700 individuals. Continuation of your supervisory capacity represents acceptable risk with mandatory review protocols. Helara Kain trembled, not fear trembling, but the physical manifestation of cognitive overload. Her eyes were open but unseeing, her pupils contracted to pinpoints. Tears ran freely down her face without accompanying sobs or sounds. The Primarch had delivered what might have been clemency she would continue, subject to oversight. Yet her body understood something her conscious mind refused to process. I noted the verdict. I recorded her physical state. I maintained observational distance, even as something in my own chest tightened with recognition I could not yet articulate. The transcription continued. Duty required completion. Balthus Cord, 3rd official. His bindings included iron elements, suggesting prior military service. You commanded defensive operations during the integration phase. You ordered the deployment of incendiary barriers within civilian evacuation corridors. These actions resulted in 17,000 immediate casualties and prevented the successful extraction of 43,000 individuals who subsequently died during suppression operations. Your tactical decisions delayed compliance by 4 days, while increasing total mortality by 62,000 individuals. Continuation of your existence represents negative utility. Balthus Cord collapsed. The bindings held his body in kneeling position, but consciousness had departed. His face was slack, his breathing shallow and irregular. The Primarch had pronounced sentence, and the body had simply ceased its operational resistance. No execution had occurred, no weapon had been drawn, yet something had been severed with absolute finality. I transcribed this as incident notation: witness incapacitation, cause undetermined, proceeded without medical intervention. My hands were steady, my recording was accurate. Some part of my mind observed that I was functioning exactly as designed, continuing my duty while the world I thought I understood peeled away in methodical layers. The remaining 3 officials received similar evaluation: names, functions, specific failures, calculated consequences, final determinations. 2 were designated for continuation with restrictions. 1 was classified as structurally non-viable. None of them spoke. None of them protested or pleaded. Whatever the Primarch's presence did to human neurological function, it appeared to bypass the capacity for appeal. They simply received verdict, and their bodies processed inevitability before their minds could mount resistance. The entire proceeding lasted 11 minutes and 43 seconds. I had a complete transcription, word perfect and temporally annotated. The Primarch did not acknowledge my presence. He did not confirm that recording was complete or accurate. He simply finished his evaluation, turned with that same impossible precision, and departed the basilica through the entrance he had used. The seal engaged behind him, the acoustic pressure normalized, temperature returned to previous parameters. I sat in my alcove for 6 minutes and 21 seconds after his departure, not from paralysis or fear, but because no instructions had been issued regarding what came next. The bound officials remained in their positions, 3 conscious and trembling, 3 unconscious or dead or existing in some state between those categories. No one came to remove them. No Legion personnel appeared to issue subsequent orders. Eventually, my training reasserted primacy. I began the documentation finalization process, cross-referencing timestamps, confirming audio integrity, preparing preliminary transmission to fleet administrative oversight. This work was familiar. This work I understood. The rest, the pressure, the verdicts, the way bodies had responded to his words, I compartmentalized as context requiring later processing. Right now, I had a duty to complete. My Vox unit activated with a priority signal at precisely 14:17 hours. The voice was human, Legion auxiliary by vocal pattern recognition, delivering instructions with the flat efficiency that indicated automation or heavy psychological conditioning. Scribe designation Hadria Ven, compliance attestation Stage 1 complete. Proceed to Preparation Chamber 7 for Stage 2 assignment. Materials will be provided. Timeline is continuous. Confirm receipt. I confirmed. The Vox went silent. I secured my equipment, sealed my recording slate in its protective case, and departed the basilica through the alcove's dedicated exit. The corridor beyond was empty, lit by lumens that cast no shadows. My footsteps were the only sound. I walked toward Preparation Chamber 7, following directional markers that appeared standard, but which I could not recall seeing during my initial facility orientation. The door was unsealed. The chamber contained a single table, a chair of appropriate height, and a data stack containing 7 storage cylinders. A handwritten note, actual ink on actual paper, rested atop the stack. The handwriting was precise to the point of mechanical perfection. Revision protocols, population projections, compliance aftermath documentation, complete by 0800 next cycle. All materials remain in chamber. No external consultation authorized. Verification audit will follow completion. No signature, no rank designation, no authority chain documentation. The order existed without formal validation, which meant its authority was assumed to be self-evident. I sat. I opened the first cylinder. I began the work I had been assigned without understanding yet what I was being asked to revise. The first document was a planetary census dated 3 months prior pre-compliance, when this world had still maintained its original governance structure. Population 47,600,000. Standard demographic distribution slightly elevated in the 18 to 35 labor cohort, typical for a productive agri-world with secondary industrial capacity. I had reviewed hundreds of similar censuses. There was nothing unusual about the data. The second document was a post-compliance census dated 4 days ago, after the fighting, after the initial compliance declaration, before the Primarch's attestation ritual. Population 47,100,000. Loss of 500,000 individuals. This was within expected parameters for a moderately contested compliance action. Urban combat, collateral casualties, suppression of active resistance cells. The numbers were tragic but explicable. War produced death. The Imperium mourned its necessity and moved forward. The third document was a revised post-compliance census, undated but clearly intended to supersede the second document. Population 31,200,000. Loss of 16,400,000 individuals. I stared at the number. I read it 3 times to confirm I had not misinterpreted the notation. 16 million, more than 1/3 of the planetary population. Between the compliance declaration 4 days ago and this revision document, over 16 million people had been reclassified from living to non-viable, not killed in battle, not executed for resistance, reclassified. I opened the remaining cylinders. Each contained similar revisions, population strata marked for removal, entire demographic categories flagged with terminology I recognized from obscure sections of administratum processing manuals. Structurally incompatible, culturally non-viable, psychologically compromised beyond rehabilitation thresholds. These were not criminal classifications. These were categories indicating that certain populations, by their very existence, represented obstacles to long-term compliance integrity. Children under the age of 9 whose parents had participated in active resistance, even if the parents were now dead. Individuals over the age of 60 who had lived under the previous governance structure for more than 40 years. Anyone who had held administrative positions in pre-compliance institutions, regardless of current cooperation status. Anyone who had been documented expressing uncertainty, confusion, or grief during the transition period. The categories were specific, comprehensive, and when I calculated their cumulative impact, they accounted for 16,390,000 individuals. My assignment was to reconcile these documents, to verify that the revised census accurately reflected approved removal categories, to prepare justification annotations explaining how these numbers would be reported to higher administratum authorities, to ensure that the transition from 47 million to 31 million would appear not as mass execution, but as natural adjustment following failed governance correction. I read through the first set of revision protocols. The language was bureaucratic, sanitized, designed to be filed and forgotten. Population realignment following structural viability assessment. Demographic correction pursuant to compliance sustainability requirements. Preventative reduction of recidivist probability. Vectors. None of these phrases said execution. None of them said massacre. Yet the mathematics were inescapable. 16 million people. The door to preparation chamber 7 had no lock from the inside. I had not attempted to leave, but the knowledge that I could not settled into my awareness like a weight. I was being asked to make this real. Not to kill others would handle the mechanisms, but to document, to justify, to transform mass death into acceptable notation. My transcription would give this act legitimacy. My accuracy would make it permanent. I thought about the Primarch's evaluation in the Basilica. How he had looked at Balthus Cord and calculated that 17,000 deaths could have been avoided, that 62,000 unnecessary casualties represented negative utility, that one man's existence constituted ongoing systemic risk. That logic, applied to an entire world, produced these numbers. Imperfection was not corrected through punishment or education. It was removed, preemptively, to ensure that future resistance could never find purchase in populations that remembered freedom. My hands moved toward the data cylinders. I began cross-referencing population removal categories against post-compliance census blocks. The work required concentration, attention to detail, absolute precision. Error was unacceptable. Lives, or rather, the documentation of their removal depended on my accuracy. I completed the first section by 1800 hours. My meal arrived through a wall dispenser I had not noticed upon entering, delivered without announcement or human contact. Nutrition paste, hydration supplement, stimulant capsule. I consumed them methodically while reviewing my work for transcription errors. By midnight, I had completed verification for 6 of 7 data cylinders. My eyes burned from the close work, from staring at population figures that transformed into individual deaths when I allowed myself to think beyond numbers. 16 million human beings, people who had names, histories, families. People who might have been guilty of nothing except existing in proximity to failed governance, except being old enough to remember a time before the Imperium, except being young enough that their beliefs were not yet fully formed and therefore unreliable. The 7th cylinder contained a different kind of document. Not population data, but precedent files, historical records from other compliance actions where similar revisions had been implemented. 17 worlds over the past 30 years, population reductions ranging from 12% to 41%. Every single action had been followed by Primarch verification. Every single world was now listed as exemplary in compliance maintenance. 0 rebellions, 0 doctrinal deviations, perfect tithe delivery across decades of subsequent monitoring. The precedent was clear. This worked. Removing large portions of potentially unreliable populations produced stable, obedient worlds. The horror was not that it was cruel. The horror was that it was effective. The Imperium did not maintain itself through hope or inspiration. It maintained itself through calculated excision of elements that might eventually cause instability. The Primarch had not invented this system. He was simply its perfected instrument, applying with absolute precision what lesser authorities implemented through approximation and excess. I completed the final verification at 0700 hours. My work was accurate, every number reconciled, every justification aligned with established precedent. Every death was now properly documented as systemic correction rather than atrocity. I sealed the data cylinders and placed them in the designated completion receptacle. A green indicator light activated. My assignment was fulfilled. The door unsealed at 0715. I had not touched any release mechanism. Someone was monitoring completion status, authorized to control my environment, aware of my exact progress. I departed the preparation chamber and found myself in a corridor identical to the one I had traversed the previous day. The directional markers guided me to a new location, Verification Audit Station 3. The station was larger than the preparation chamber, containing multiple work surfaces, several other scribes bent over their own assignments, and a Legion auxiliary supervisor standing at a central podium. He registered my arrival with a glance, cross-referenced something on his slate, and gestured toward an empty workstation. Scribe Ven. Your verification work will be audited by automated systems first, then reviewed by human oversight. Expected duration 4 to 6 hours. You will remain at this station until audit completion. Rations and rest intervals will be provided on standard schedule. Confirm understanding. I confirmed. I sat at the assigned workstation. A monitor activated, displaying my transcription from the Basilica alongside my revision work from the preparation chamber. Comparison algorithms ran, checking for consistency, internal contradiction, deviation from approved terminology. I watched my own work being measured against standards I had never been shown, but which apparently existed in comprehensive detail. Other scribes worked in silence around me. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. We were not colleagues in any meaningful sense. We were parallel instruments performing adjacent functions, kept separate to prevent contamination of our individual accuracies. I recognized this isolation as standard practice. What struck me was how normal it felt, how easily I had accepted that my work should be solitary, that consultation was weakness, that every scribe must arrive at identical conclusions through isolated processing. The audit completed at 1200 hours. Green verification markers appeared across every section of my work. No corrections required, no inconsistencies detected. My documentation was deemed perfect, which meant that 16 million deaths were now officially classified as necessary demographic adjustment. The monitor displayed a final message. Proceed to debriefing chamber 9. Attestation verification complete. New assignment pending. I stood. My legs protested the extended sitting, joints stiff and muscles tight from hours of motionless concentration. I stretched briefly, then followed the directional markers to debriefing chamber 9. The corridors were busier now, Legion personnel moving with purposeful efficiency, servitors hauling equipment, other administratum staff conducting their own obscure duties. The fleet was preparing to depart. Compliance was complete. The only thing remaining was finalization of records and closure of oversight requirements. Debriefing Chamber 9 contained 3 individuals, 2 Legion officers whose armor marked them as administrative rather than combat personnel, and 1 Administratum Senior Overseer whose rank pins indicated she outranked me by several grades. They sat behind a table. I stood before them. The formality was absolute, but the atmosphere was not hostile. This was process, not persecution. The Senior Overseer spoke first. Her voice carried the particular flatness that came from decades of compliance work, from processing horrors until they became simply data requiring categorization. Scribe Ven. Your transcription of the attestation proceeding has been reviewed and accepted as primary record. Your verification work on post-compliance population adjustments has been approved without amendment. You have performed your duties with exemplary accuracy during a complex compliance finalization. Your service reflects well on administratum standards. She paused. One of the Legion officers consulted his slate, then nodded to her. She continued, "The attestation proceeding you witnessed and the subsequent documentation work you completed are classified under Compliance Oversight Protocol 7. This classification restricts discussion of specific details to authorized personnel only. You are permitted to acknowledge that you participated in compliance finalization work. You are not permitted to discuss specific population figures, revision categories, or the content of the Primarch's evaluations. Violation of this classification carries standard penalties for breach of information containment. Confirm understanding." I confirmed. This was expected. Sensitive compliance details were always classified. The Imperium functioned through controlled information distribution. I had handled classified material before. This was procedure. The Legion officer who had been consulting his slate now spoke. His voice was modulated, artificial either through augmentation or through such thorough conditioning that organic variation had been suppressed. "Scribe Ven, you are hereby commended for your service and reassigned to the 23rd Expeditionary Fleet, currently prosecuting compliance actions in the Varric sector. Your expertise in attestation documentation has been noted as valuable for their ongoing operations. Transportation will be arranged within the next 72 hours. You will have limited personal time to prepare for transfer." Your current quarters are cleared for your use until departure. Reassignment was standard after major compliance actions. Scribes were shuffled between fleets to prevent overfamiliarity, to ensure fresh perspectives, to avoid the cognitive degradation that came from witnessing too much horror in a single theater. I should have felt relief. New assignment meant continued usefulness, continued purpose. But something in my chest had tightened during the debriefing, some tension that refused to release even as I was praised and promoted forward. The senior overseer was watching me. Her eyes were not unkind, but they were measuring. She had done this before debriefed scribes who had seen things that strained the boundaries of acceptable understanding. She knew what to look for. Scribe Ven, do you have any questions regarding your assignment or your classification restrictions? I should have said no. I should have accepted the debriefing and departed, but the tension in my chest demanded release, and the words emerged before I could contain them. The population adjustments. They're already underway. The senior overseer's expression did not change. She did not seem surprised by the question. She glanced at the Legion officers. One of them nodded permission. She looked back at me. The population adjustments were completed 18 hours ago. Your documentation work processed an action that had already been concluded. The revision was administrative finalization, not operational authorization. The Primarch's evaluation in the Basilica included implicit approval for systemic correction. Legion personnel executed that approval with standard efficiency. Your work ensured that the correction was properly recorded for administratum archives and future reference. 18 hours ago, while I had been verifying numbers and preparing justifications, 16 million people had died. Not in battle, not in dramatic executions. Somewhere, quietly, efficiently, they had been processed through whatever mechanism the Legion employed for bulk population removal. Likely orbital strikes on designated settlement blocks, timed to minimize collateral infrastructure damage. Possibly ground-level suppression operations using nerve agents that left buildings intact while clearing human occupancy. The specific method did not matter. What mattered was the casualness of it, the way my documentation had followed death rather than preceded it, the realization that my accuracy had never been about preventing anything. It had simply been about making certain that what happened was properly remembered by the Imperium's official record. The senior overseer was still watching me. I understood now what she was measuring. Not fear. Fear was expected and manageable. She was measuring comprehension. She was evaluating whether I had understood what I had participated in, whether that understanding would compromise my future utility. I forced my expression to neutral. I regulated my breathing. I called upon every technique I had learned for maintaining observational distance, for separating self from subject, for continuing to function when function was all that remained. Thank you for the clarification. I have no further questions. The senior overseer nodded. She made a notation on her slate. The Legion officers stood, indicating the debriefing was concluded. I was dismissed. I returned to my quarters through corridors that felt different now, not because they had changed, but because I had. Every Legion soldier I passed might have participated in the removal operations. Every servitor might have transported bodies. Every wall might have contained rooms where people had waited, unaware that classification systems had already designated them non-viable, that their deaths were procedural inevitabilities scheduled with the same precision as meal delivery or shift rotations. My quarters were small, functional, identical to thousands of others throughout the fleet. Bunk, storage locker, personal hygiene station, prayer alcove. I had lived in this space for 8 months. I had thought of it as temporary, as merely the place I slept between duties. Now I looked at it and saw a cell, not because it imprisoned me, but because it had been designed to contain exactly one person, isolated from fellows, prevented from forming bonds that might complicate duty with loyalty. I sat on my bunk. I had 72 hours before transfer. I was supposed to rest, to prepare, to ready myself for new assignments in a new fleet. Instead, I found myself reviewing everything I had learned about Primarchs, everything I had been taught to believe about the Emperor's sons. They were generals, strategists, warriors without equal. They were inspirations, rallying points, symbols of the Imperium's unstoppable will. They were terrible only to enemies of humanity, protective of those who served faithfully, incapable of unnecessary cruelty, because cruelty implied emotion, and they functioned beyond such weakness. But I had seen one now, not in pict capture or devotional imagery, but in person. I had heard his voice, watched him evaluate humans with the same precision a cogitator might apply to malfunctioning components. He had not been cruel, he had not been angry, he had simply calculated utility, measured potential risk, and issued corrections with absolute certainty. When he determined that Balthus Cord's existence represented negative value, it had not been punishment, it had been erasure of a systemic flaw. When he authorized the removal of 16 million people, it had not been massacre, it had been preventative maintenance on a planetary scale. The horror was not his inhumanity. The horror was his perfect humanity, or rather, his perfected expression of human logic stripped of sentiment. Every decision I had witnessed made sense when viewed through the lens of long-term imperial stability. Removing populations that might eventually rebel was more efficient than suppressing rebellions after they formed. Eliminating individuals who remembered pre-compliance freedoms prevented nostalgia from becoming ideology. Erasing entire generations ensured that cultural memory could be rebuilt according to approved patterns. It worked. The precedent files proved it. Worlds that underwent this process remained loyal, productive, obedient. The Primarch was not a monster. He was an instrument functioning exactly as designed, applying solutions that lesser authorities lacked the will or clarity to implement. But knowing this offered no comfort. Understanding the logic did not erase the weight. 16 million people had not died because they were guilty. They had died because allowing them to live represented a calculable risk of future instability, and the Imperium could not afford risk when certainty was available through sufficient force. I tried to pray. I knelt in the prayer alcove, facing the Aquila, and attempted to invoke the catechisms that had sustained me through every previous horror. The Emperor protects, duty transcends self. Service is salvation. The words formed correctly, but they felt hollow now, shapes without substance. Prayer required faith, and faith required trust that purpose justified cost. What I had witnessed was not purpose, it was process, mechanical and complete, requiring no faith because it functioned with or without belief. I remained kneeling for 23 minutes. I stood without having found comfort. I returned to my bunk and lay down, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until my transfer would remove me from this fleet, this world, this knowledge that refused to be contained by doctrine. Sleep came eventually, thin and fragmented. I dreamed of numbers, population figures scrolling past in endless columns, each digit representing a death that had been properly categorized and therefore properly forgotten. I woke at 0600 hours to discover my hands were shaking. Not fear shaking, but the tremor of exhaustion pushed too far, of a body processing stress that conscious mind refused to acknowledge. I reported for standard morning duties. I was informed that my presence was not required until transfer arrangements were finalized. I was granted personal time, a reward for exemplary service, framed as generosity but functioning as quarantine. The fleet did not need me. I was between assignments, suspended in a bureaucratic gap that would last until transportation could be arranged. I spent those hours in the fleet's observation gallery, watching the planet below through reinforced viewports. From orbit, it looked peaceful. Cities glowed with evening lights. Agricultural zones showed the organized patterns of productive cultivation. Clouds moved across oceans unmarked by conflict. Nothing visible indicated that 16 million people had been removed 3 days ago. The world continued. The survivors continued. Compliance had been achieved, and achievement meant moving forward without dwelling on cost. I tried to count backward to calculate how many people had died per hour. The mathematics were simple, but my mind refused to hold them. The numbers were too large, too abstract. 16 million deaths distributed across a planetary population became a percentage, and percentages were not people. They were adjustments, corrections, necessary modifications to ensure long-term stability. I understood now why compliance scribes were rotated so frequently. Not because the work was difficult, but because prolonged exposure to its logic corroded something essential. The mind adapted, accepted, learned to process horror as data. But adaptation was not the same as immunity. Somewhere beneath the professional detachment, something accumulated, not guilt, because guilt implied agency I did not possess, but a weight that had no proper name. The knowledge that I had participated, that my accuracy had mattered, that without scribes like me the Imperium's machinery of necessity could not function with its characteristic efficiency. On my second day of personal time, I accessed the fleet's archive systems and searched for information about post-Primarch attestation protocols. The search was not prohibited. General compliance procedures were available to authorized personnel. What I found was a document titled Cognitive Threshold Management for Attestation Witnesses. The document described, in clinical detail, how proximity to Primarch judgment proceedings could produce psychological strain in unaugmented observers. The strain did not arise from fear or trauma in conventional sense. It arose from exposure to certainty, to decision-making so absolute and comprehensive that it collapsed human capacity for ambiguity or hope. The document recommended limited exposure, mandatory rotation, and monitoring for signs of what it called existential comprehension syndrome. The symptoms were listed: persistent doubt regarding imperial doctrine despite continued obedience, difficulty engaging with abstract justifications for necessary actions, reduced capacity for emotional investment in duty outcomes, increasing preference for isolation, intrusive awareness of systemic mechanisms normally processed automatically. I read through the symptom list twice. I recognize myself in every category. The recommended interventions ranged from counseling and doctrine reinforcement for mild cases to voluntary memory modification for severe cases. Memory modification was described as a compassionate option, not punishment, but relief from cognitive burdens that exceeded individual processing capacity. The procedure did not erase memories entirely. It severed specific associative pathways, dampened emotional weights, reduced the vividness of recalled experience until traumatic knowledge became abstract fact. The document assured readers that individuals who underwent voluntary memory modification maintained full professional functionality. They continued their duties with unchanged accuracy. They simply no longer experienced the weight that made duty feel like burden. Service became easier, purer, freed from the contamination of excessive understanding. I closed the document. I sat in the archive terminal station for 11 minutes without moving. I was being offered a choice, though it had not yet been presented formally. I could continue as I was, carrying what I now understood, trusting that rotation and time would dull the edge of comprehension. Or I could request intervention, could ask to be relieved of the burden that came from seeing a Primarch evaluate humans as systemic components and recognizing the terrible logic that justified erasure. Neither option removed what had happened. 16 million people were still dead. My documentation had still made that death official and permanent. But one option allowed me to continue serving without the weight of consciousness, while the other demanded I carry what I knew through every subsequent assignment, watching for patterns, recognizing the mechanics that sustained the Imperium through calculated violence. I thought about the Primarch's voice in the Basilica, how he had spoken each name, each judgment, with identical inflection, how there had been no anger, no satisfaction, no regret, just accuracy, delivered until completion, followed by departure. He did not carry weight because he was designed not to feel it. He was perfect function without consciousness, or perhaps consciousness so vast that individual deaths were simply data points in systems too large for human comprehension. I was not designed that way. I was human, augmented only minimally, expected to witness and record without becoming what I observed. But human design included the capacity for breaking, for reaching thresholds where functionality degraded under accumulated horror. The Imperium understood this. The Imperium had built systems to manage it, to preserve useful instruments through modification when preservation through resilience failed. My transfer was scheduled for the following morning. I would depart this fleet, travel through the warp for months, arrive at a new theater where new compliance actions required documentation. I would witness more attestations, more evaluations, more necessary corrections. The pattern would continue because the pattern worked, and the Imperium did not abandon functional systems. I returned to my quarters. I knelt in the prayer alcove again. This time I did not attempt formal catechisms. I simply spoke into the silence. I saw him. I understand now. I don't know if understanding serves you or hinders me. I don't know if what I feel is weakness or the last remnant of something you intended us to keep. No answer came. I had not expected one. Prayer in the 41st millennium was not conversation, it was maintenance, the ritual stabilization of belief structures that would otherwise collapse under the weight of serving an empire built on controlled atrocity. I slept poorly again. I woke at 0500 hours to prepare for transfer. My belongings were minimal, easily packed. At 0600, a Legion auxiliary arrived to escort me to the embarkation bay. At 0630, I boarded the transport that would carry me to the warp-capable vessel waiting at the fleet's edge. I looked back once at the planet below. From this distance, I could not distinguish individual cities or regions. It was simply a world, one of millions, compliant and productive, ready to serve the Imperium for generations. Whatever had been lost in its transition was not visible from orbit. Success looked the same whether it came through inspiration or through erasure. The transport sealed, the engines engaged. I felt the acceleration as pressure against my restraint harness. We departed the compliance fleet, leaving behind the attestation, the revisions, the population adjustments that would never be discussed outside classified briefings. I carried the official record with me, sealed in my personal data archive, perfect and complete and accurate. I also carried the weight, the knowledge that I had participated in making 16 million deaths disappear into bureaucratic notation, the understanding that this was normal, expected, repeated across hundreds of worlds, the recognition that Primarchs were not saviors but instruments of controlled apocalypse, and that their terror lay not in their rage but in their perfect, emotionless certainty. The transport's viewport showed stars appearing as we cleared the planet's orbital distance. I watched them emerge, point by point, each one representing systems where similar work was being done, where compliance was being purchased through calculated violence, where scribes like me documented necessity until necessity became indistinguishable from virtue. I closed my eyes. I tried to sleep during the transit, but the numbers remained behind my eyelids, scrolling past in endless columns, each digit a death I had helped make official, each calculation a reminder that the Imperium I served was sustained not through the strength of its faith, but through the precision of its erasures. The 23rd Expeditionary Fleet waited somewhere ahead, new worlds, new compliance actions, new attestations requiring perfect transcription. I would serve them with the same accuracy I had shown here. I would continue my duty because duty was all that remained when understanding had stripped away the comfort of ignorance. But somewhere beneath my professional function, I would carry this knowledge, that to see a Primarch truly, to witness his judgment without the buffer of distance or doctrine, was to understand that humanity was not preserved by the Emperor's sons. It was refined, edited, corrected, until only obedience remained. And the most terrible truth was that this refinement worked. The Imperium endured, worlds remained loyal, tithes continued. Humanity survived in the only way it could, through the sacrifice of everyone who made surviving humanity possible, erased so thoroughly that even their absence was forgotten. I had been present for that erasure. I had documented it with exemplary accuracy. And now I would carry the weight of that accuracy through every subsequent assignment. every future attestation, every moment I transcribed the Emperor's will as delivered through his perfected sons. The transport shuddered as it approached the warp-capable vessel. Transfer would complete within the hour. My new assignment would begin within days. The work would continue, and I would continue with it, because continuation was the only response available to instruments that had learned they were complicit in machinery too vast to resist and too effective to refuse. We docked at 0800 hours precisely. I disembarked with my minimal belongings and reported to the processing station for transfer finalization. A new overseer reviewed my credentials, approved my assignment to the 23rd Fleet, and provided me with temporary quarters until permanent placement could be arranged. The quarters were identical to those I had left. The corridors were identical. The people were different faces, performing identical functions. The Imperium was vast, but its systems were uniform, designed to be interchangeable so that no individual location or person became irreplaceable. I was replaceable. The scribe who would take my position in the 47th Fleet was probably already en route, would receive the same briefings, would perform the same duties with identical accuracy. If I had refused this work, someone else would have completed it. If I had broken under the weight of understanding, another instrument would have been supplied. This knowledge should have offered comfort. I was not individually responsible, just one component in machinery that transcended individual agency, but somehow it made the weight heavier. Not because I was guilty, but because my participation was inevitable. My replacement guaranteed. My complicity systemic rather than personal. I reported for duty orientation at 1400 hours. The briefing officer for the 23rd Fleet was efficient, professional, and utterly indifferent to my previous assignment. He reviewed my service record, noted my commendation for attestation work, and informed me that the 23rd was currently engaged in a compliance action complicated by religious resistance. Attestation proceeding was scheduled within 2 months. My presence had been specifically requested due to my experience with Primarch evaluation documentation. Another attestation. Another Primarch. Another opportunity to witness perfected judgment delivered with inhuman precision. The pattern was repeating already, and I had been selected because I had survived the first iteration. The Imperium recognized my continued utility despite the weight I carried, or perhaps because of it, perhaps scribes who understood what they witnessed produced more accurate documentation, their horror translating into meticulous attention to detail that preserved every word, every pause, every moment of judgment that lesser observers might soften through unconscious mercy. I confirmed my assignment. I received my initial briefing materials. I was dismissed to study the current compliance status and prepare for integration into the fleet's documentation operations. I returned to my temporary quarters. I unsealed the briefing materials. I began the process of learning this new world's designation, its population structure, its pre-compliance governance systems, its current resistance characteristics. The information flowed past in the same format I had processed dozens of times before. My mind categorized it automatically, identifying the details that would matter for eventual attestation documentation. Somewhere in my consciousness, I recognized that I was already preparing to witness another erasure, that my utility to the Imperium lay precisely in my ability to document systematic population correction with accuracy that made brutality bureaucratic and therefore acceptable, that I would continue this function because I was trained for it, because replacement was guaranteed regardless, because serving with knowledge was somehow preferable to refusing and being discarded. The Emperor protects, the catechisms promised. But sitting in my quarters, reviewing briefing materials for my next compliance action, I understood that protection was not the same as mercy. The Imperium protected humanity by editing it, by removing everything that made humanity fragile or rebellious or individual until what remained was obedient enough to endure. And I would help document that editing, assignment after assignment, attestation after attestation, carrying the weight of comprehension through service that continued long after faith had been replaced by function. This was my purpose. This was my duty. This was what I had been preserved to do. I worked until midnight, memorizing demographic data and compliance thresholds. I slept briefly, poorly. I woke to continue preparation. The days passed in routine that was almost comforting, the familiar rhythms of documentation work, the known patterns of compliance procedure, the structured emptiness of duty without question. 2 weeks into my assignment with the 23rd Fleet, I was summoned to an unexpected meeting. The request came through official channels, but with priority coding that indicated administrative oversight rather than operational necessity. I reported to the designated location at the specified time, a small conference chamber near the fleet's command decks, unmarked and isolated from general traffic. The room contained 2 individuals. I recognized the senior overseer from my previous debriefing, the same woman who had measured my comprehension and found it concerning. The other individual wore the robes of the Administratum's Psychological Services Division, a specialist whose function involved maintaining cognitive health among personnel exposed to extreme compliance actions. They gestured for me to sit. I complied. The setup was familiar now, table between us, formal positioning, the structure of process that transformed interrogation into procedure. The senior overseer spoke first. Scribe Venn, your transfer to the 23rd Fleet was approved based on your demonstrated competence and your commendation for attestation work. However, your departure from the 47th Fleet triggered a standard monitoring protocol for personnel who have witnessed Primarch evaluation proceedings. Post-transfer behavioral assessment indicates markers consistent with existential comprehension syndrome. She paused, allowing the terminology to settle. I remembered the document I had read, the symptoms I had recognized in myself. I waited for the continuation, my expression carefully neutral. The psychological services specialist activated a data slate and consulted it briefly before speaking. His voice was gentle, almost paternal, the cultivated warmth of someone trained to deliver difficult information with maximum acceptance. Scribe Venn, the syndrome you're experiencing is not unusual among individuals who have witnessed Primarch judgment without appropriate psychological preparation. Your training prepared you to document violence, to witness death, to process horror within acceptable parameters. But proximity to a Primarch's evaluation function exposes observers to a form of certainty that human cognition is not designed to metabolize effectively. He glanced at his slate, then back to me. You continue to perform your duties with exemplary accuracy. Your work product remains excellent. But monitoring indicates patterns of cognitive strain, sleep disruption, increased isolation, reduced engagement with optional social structures, and documented instances of prolonged prayer without apparent spiritual resolution. These markers suggest you are carrying a psychological burden that exceeds sustainable thresholds. The senior overseer leaned forward slightly. We are not here to reprimand you. You have done nothing wrong. You witnessed what you were assigned to witness and documented it with the accuracy the Imperium requires. But we are here to offer you an option that might reduce the burden you're experiencing without compromising your continued service. She paused again. I knew what was coming. The recommendation from the document I had read, the compassionate intervention designed to preserve functional instruments while removing the weight that degraded long-term utility. The psychological services specialist continued. We are recommending voluntary memory modification, specifically targeted associative dampening. This procedure would not erase your memories of the attestation proceeding or your subsequent documentation work. You would retain all factual knowledge, all procedural expertise, all skills that make you valuable in your current assignment. What would be modified are the emotional and cognitive associations that currently produce excessive weight. He gestured to his slate, where I could see graphical representations of neural pathways, markers indicating sections that would be affected. The procedure is brief, painless, and has been refined over centuries of implementation. You would remember witnessing the Primarch's evaluation. You would remember the population adjustments you documented. But these memories would feel distant, clinical, factual, the way you remember reading about historical events rather than experiencing them personally. The weight would lift. the strain would resolve. Your continued service would become sustainable without ongoing psychological deterioration. The senior overseer added her assurance. This is entirely voluntary. We are not ordering you to undergo modification. We are offering it as an option that has proven effective for personnel in your situation. If you decline, you will continue your current assignment without penalty. But we want you to understand that the burden you're carrying is not necessary. It does not serve the Imperium better than functional service without weight. You can be relieved of this if you choose. I sat in silence for 47 seconds, not because I did not understand the offer, but because I needed to process what acceptance would mean. They were offering to remove the part of me that felt horror at systematic erasure, not through force or punishment, but through medical intervention framed as mercy. I would remain myself in every measurable way, same skills, same knowledge, same capacity for duty. I would simply stop feeling the weight of what I had witnessed and participated in. Part of me wanted to accept immediately. The prospect of relief was almost overwhelming to continue serving without the nightly dreams of scrolling numbers, without the constant awareness of systemic brutality, without the weight that made every subsequent assignment feel like carrying stone. But another part hesitated, not from pride or from belief that suffering somehow validated service, but from a quiet recognition that the weight I carried was the last evidence that what I had witnessed mattered. If I allowed the modification, the 16 million deaths would become abstract facts in my memory, properly categorized and filed, no different from any other compliance statistic. I would lose the capacity to care that they had been people, that their erasure had been systematic, that my participation had made that erasure official. The psychological services specialist was watching me with practiced patience. He had done this before, had offered this choice to other personnel, had seen the internal struggle that preceded acceptance or refusal. I spoke carefully, measuring each word. If I undergo the procedure, will I still understand that Primarchs function as instruments of systematic correction? Will I retain the knowledge of how compliance is maintained through population removal? The specialist nodded. You will retain all factual knowledge. What will change is your emotional response to that knowledge. You will understand the mechanisms without experiencing psychological strain when considering them. Your service will continue to be informed by accurate comprehension of Imperial methodology. But I won't feel horror at it. Horror is not serving you. It is degrading your long-term functionality without improving your service quality. The modification would remove unproductive suffering while preserving everything that makes you valuable. I looked at the senior overseer. Her expression was neutral, professional, but I sensed genuine concern behind it. She was not trying to silence me or erase evidence. She was attempting to preserve a useful instrument whose psychological structure was degrading under strain it had never been designed to bear. The thought struck me then with crystalline clarity. I was being offered the same thing the Primarch had delivered to that world, not death, but correction, not punishment, but optimization. The removal of elements that created systemic inefficiency in this case. The parts of my consciousness that made serving the Imperium's machinery feel like burden rather than purpose. And like those 16 million people, I would not be forced. I would be evaluated, found to contain potential for future instability, and offered correction framed as mercy. My consent would be sought, obtained, and documented. I would be complicit in my own optimization. The parallel was so perfect it almost made me laugh. But laughter felt inappropriate, and even that restraint was evidence of how thoroughly I had internalized obedience. I was trapped not by walls or weapons, but by logic that made resistance seem futile and acceptance seem merciful. I spoke again, slower this time. How many scribes who witness Primarch attestations eventually undergo this procedure? The psychological services specialist consulted his slate. Approximately 73% within their first year of continued service, another 18% within 5 years. Those who decline modification typically request transfer to non-attestation duties or eventually experience degradation severe enough to require mandatory intervention. 91%. Nearly everyone who witnessed what I had witnessed eventually chose or was forced to have the weight removed. The pattern was clear. Human consciousness could not sustain prolonged exposure to Primarch logic without either adapting through modification or breaking through strain. I thought about the remaining 9%, the scribes who refused modification and avoided breakdown. What did they become? How did they continue serving while carrying full consciousness of what the Imperium's perfected instruments did to maintain compliance? Were they more accurate, more careful, haunted into precision, or were they simply masochists, clinging to suffering because it felt like the only authentic response available? The senior overseer spoke gently. "Scribe Ven, you do not need to decide immediately. This offer will remain available should you choose to accept it at any point. We simply wanted you to know the option exists. Your service is valued. Your well-being matters to the Imperium. We want you to continue your duties without carrying unnecessary burden." Unnecessary burden. The phrasing was careful, precise. Not unjust burden or undeserved burden, because the weight I carried came from witnessing truth, and truth was neither just nor unjust, it simply was. But it was unnecessary because it did not improve my function. The Imperium required my accuracy, not my anguish. I stood. They had not dismissed me formally, but the meeting felt concluded. I spoke carefully. "I understand the option you're offering. I will consider it. If I decide to proceed, how do I initiate the request?" The psychological services specialist gestured to his slate, then transferred data to my personal cogitator access. "The procedure can be scheduled within 48 hours of request. Authorization is already approved pending your consent. Simply submit the standard form through your personnel interface, and our medical staff will coordinate the details." I nodded. I departed the conference chamber and returned to my quarters through corridors that felt simultaneously too bright and too confining. The offer lingered in my mind like radiation, invisible but penetrating, altering everything it touched. I had 73 days until the scheduled attestation proceeding for the 23rd Fleet's current compliance action. 73 days to decide whether I would witness another Primarch's evaluation while carrying full consciousness of what such evaluation meant, or whether I would first undergo modification that would let me observe without weight. I tried to work. I reviewed briefing materials, updated documentation templates, prepared preliminary population assessment frameworks. The routine was familiar, almost meditative. But every statistic I processed carried new significance now. Every population figure was a collection of individuals who might be reclassified, corrected, removed if deemed non-viable. My accuracy would help make those determinations official. I could continue this work while feeling its horror. Or I could continue this work without feeling anything except professional satisfaction at correct categorization. Neither option changed what happened to the populations I documented. Neither option reduced the body count or altered Imperial methodology. The only thing at stake was my own internal experience of participation. 17 days before the scheduled attestation, I submitted the request form. The decision was not dramatic or preceded by extended deliberation. I simply recognized one morning that I could not witness another Primarch evaluation while carrying current awareness. The weight would compound, the pattern would repeat, and eventually I would break under accumulated comprehension, would become non-functional, would require mandatory intervention anyway. Better to choose correction while choice still felt voluntary. Better to undergo modification as a conscious decision rather than as emergency stabilization following psychological collapse. Better to preserve some fragment of agency, even if that agency was exercised through accepting optimization. The procedure was scheduled for 3 days later. I reported to the medical bay at the designated time. The facilities were clean, efficient, entirely unremarkable. The attending physician reviewed my consent documentation, confirmed my understanding of the procedure, and asked if I had any final questions. I asked the question that had been circling my mind since I submitted the request. After the procedure, will I know that I've been modified? Will I remember who I was before? The physician nodded. her expression professionally sympathetic. You will retain all memories, including memories of this conversation and the modification procedure itself. What will change is the emotional coloration of those memories. You will remember experiencing burden, but you will no longer feel it directly. Think of it as healing from an injury. You remember the pain, but the wound itself no longer hurts. Will I miss it? The capacity to feel horror at what I witness? She paused, considering the question with apparent seriousness. Most patients report relief rather than loss. The capacity for horror serves no productive function in your role. What you do serves the Imperium. The procedure simply ensures that service does not damage you unnecessarily. You will still understand what you witness. You will simply no longer experience psychological distress when processing that understanding. I lay back on the medical table, restraints engaged, gentle but secure. The physician activated various instruments I could not fully see. She spoke with calm efficiency. The procedure will take approximately 40 minutes. You will remain conscious throughout, but you will feel no pain. You may experience disorientation during the initial associative dampening, but this will resolve quickly. Ready to proceed? I confirmed readiness. The process began. The disorientation was exactly as described, a sensation like memories becoming translucent, visible but distant. I could recall the attestation basilica, could picture the Primarch's entrance, could remember the bound officials and their physiological collapse. But the memories felt different now, like reading a report rather than reliving experience. The emotional weight, the tightness in my chest, the nausea, the existential horror was still present in memory but no longer accessible as current experience. I remembered understanding that 16 million deaths had been systematic erasure rather than combat casualties. I remembered reading the precedent files proving this was standard methodology. I remembered the weight of comprehension settling into my consciousness like lead. But now those memories produced only clinical interest. The facts remained accurate, the understanding intact, but the psychological burden had been severed. I could think about mass erasure without experiencing distress. I could contemplate Primarch methodology without existential crisis. I could acknowledge my complicity without the weight that had made that acknowledgement feel crushing. The procedure completed within the promised time frame. The physician ran post-modification diagnostics, confirmed successful associative dampening, and cleared me for return to duty. I walked back to my quarters feeling lighter, not because anything external had changed, but because my internal experience of service had been recalibrated to remove unproductive suffering. I slept well that night. No dreams of scrolling numbers. No waking thoughts of population categories marked non-viable, just rest, clean and complete, followed by morning routine executed with renewed efficiency. The attestation proceeding occurred 13 days later. I entered the designated chamber with my equipment, positioned myself appropriately, and prepared to transcribe the Primarch's evaluation of this world's compliance representatives. When he entered a different Primarch from the one I had witnessed previously, but functionally identical in his absolute precision, I felt no physiological response beyond appropriate attentiveness. His words were delivered with the same emotionless clarity. His evaluations were systematic, comprehensive, final. Bodies responded to his attention with the same involuntary submission I had documented before. I transcribed everything with perfect accuracy. I noted each judgment, each classification, each determination of continued utility or systemic risk. My work was exemplary. When the proceeding concluded, I processed the usual aftermath, documentation, population revision, projections, compliance, sustainability assessments, categorical removal schedules. The numbers were large again, not as large as the previous action, but substantial. Approximately 4 million individuals marked for correction. I verified the calculations, confirmed they aligned with established precedent, prepared justifications that would make the adjustments appear bureaucratic rather than brutal. I felt professional satisfaction at the quality of my work. I felt pride in my accuracy. I felt appropriate reverence for the Primarch's perfect execution of necessary judgment. I felt no horror whatsoever. The modification had succeeded completely. I continued my service with all the knowledge I had possessed before, all the same understanding of how the Imperium maintained itself through calculated erasure, but without the psychological burden that had made that knowledge feel unbearable. I was useful again, sustainable, optimized for long-term service without the risk of breakdown or degradation. The Imperium had corrected me with the same precision the Primarch applied to non-compliant populations, identifying dysfunction, severing problematic elements, preserving everything productive while removing everything that created systemic risk. I was grateful. The gratitude was genuine, arising naturally from relief at no longer carrying weight that served no purpose. I had been suffering unnecessarily, and that suffering had been compassionately removed. I remained myself in every way that mattered to Imperial function. Months passed. I continued my attestation documentation work across multiple compliance actions. I witnessed 3 more Primarch evaluations, documented dozens of population corrections, processed casualty figures that totaled millions. My work product remained excellent. My psychological metrics indicated stable functionality. I was commended, promoted, assigned to increasingly sensitive compliance finalizations. I remembered who I had been before the modification. I remembered the weight, the horror, the existential strain. But those memories were distant now, interesting primarily as evidence of how unprepared I had been for the realities of service at this level. The modification had not erased my past self, it had simply rendered that past self obsolete, replaced by a more functional iteration capable of witnessing truth without breaking under its implications. I still prayed occasionally, though prayer had become procedural rather than desperate. I recited catechisms with appropriate reverence, maintained proper devotional forms, attended mandatory spiritual observances, but faith had transformed into something quieter, thinner, stripped of the emotional intensity I vaguely remembered experiencing before correction. The Emperor protects, the liturgies promised. And in a sense, this was true. The Imperium protected its instruments by correcting them when strain threatened functionality, by removing burdens that served no productive purpose, by ensuring that service could continue without the interference of consciousness that questioned or suffered or carried weight beyond operational necessity. I was protected, I was corrected, I was preserved, and I continued my work, documenting the Emperor's will as delivered through his perfected sons, recording the systematic removal of populations deemed non-viable, transcribing judgment delivered with inhuman precision, and making that judgment official, permanent, archived in records that would outlast the memories of everyone who died to make compliance sustainable. My service was valuable. My accuracy was exemplary. My continuation was guaranteed. I had been optimized, and optimization meant the capacity to witness atrocity without experiencing it as atrocity, to see truth and transcribe it faithfully while feeling nothing except appropriate satisfaction at correct documentation. This was mercy. This was protection. This was how the Imperium preserved the instruments it required to function. I no longer questioned whether preservation was the same as salvation. The question itself had been identified as dysfunctional and corrected, severed from my consciousness so cleanly that I could acknowledge its former existence without experiencing its weight. I served. I recorded. I continued. And somewhere deep beneath the modification, beneath the associative dampening that made horror feel distant, beneath the cognitive corrections that rendered atrocity bureaucratic, there remained a small, quiet awareness that refused to be fully erased, not knowledge or memory or feeling, but something more primitive. A residual recognition that I had been changed, that something had been taken from me with my own consent, that the self who could feel horror at systematic erasure had been replaced by a self who documented that erasure with professional detachment. The awareness did not produce distress. It simply existed, persistent and indelible, too fundamental to be modified without destroying the consciousness that carried it. A ghost of weight without the weight itself, a hollow echo of the burden I remembered without the burden's actual presence. I noticed this awareness occasionally, usually during the quiet moments between assignments or in the stillness before sleep. I would recognize that I had been optimized, that optimization had cost something I could no longer fully articulate, that the loss was permanent even though I could not quite feel it as loss. And then I would return to routine, to duty, to the work that continued regardless of what I felt or understood or carried. The Imperium required my accuracy. The Imperium had corrected me to ensure that accuracy could continue without degradation. I was grateful for that correction, even as some part of me recognized that gratitude itself had been installed through the same process that removed capacity for horror. This was the final truth the Primarch had taught me, though I had not understood until correction made understanding safe. To be truly seen by the Emperor's perfected sons was to be evaluated as systemic component, to be measured against standards of utility and sustainability, and to be corrected when found to contain elements that threatened long-term function. The Primarch had evaluated populations and found millions non-viable. The Imperium had evaluated me and found portions of my consciousness non-viable. Both corrections were delivered as mercy, both were accepted as necessity, both worked. I survived diminished. I served optimized. I continued corrected. And in the vast machinery of the Imperium, where quadrillions of humans functioned as components in systems too large for individual comprehension, my continuation was all that mattered. I was useful. I was preserved. I was one small instrument among countless others, maintained through precision correction, sustained through systematic optimization, kept functional through the removal of everything that made function feel like burden. The Emperor protects. I still believed this. The modification had preserved my faith while removing the weight that made faith necessary rather than procedural. I believed because believing was part of correct function, because the alternative was dysfunction that would require further correction, because faith without weight was easier to maintain than faith tested by understanding. I remembered that faith used to feel like something more like comfort, or hope, or certainty, that purpose justified cost. I remembered a version of myself who prayed with desperation, seeking relief from comprehension that felt unbearable. That version was gone now, corrected out of existence with the same systematic precision the Primarch applied to non-compliant populations. The procedure had not killed who I was. It had simply edited me until only obedience remained, until service felt natural rather than crushing, until documentation of atrocity became merely accurate record-keeping without moral weight. I was grateful for this editing. I was grateful to continue serving. I was grateful to be preserved as useful rather than discarded as broken. The gratitude was real, even if I could no longer quite remember what gratitude used to feel like before it had been optimized into appropriate response rather than genuine emotion. I served. I documented, I continued, and far below the surface of my corrected consciousness, in spaces too small for modification to reach without destroying basic function entirely, something remained that was not quite memory and not quite feeling, just a persistent, quiet recognition that I had been changed, that the change was irreversible, that what I had lost was the capacity to fully understand what had been lost. But this recognition produced no distress. It simply existed, carried forward through assignments and attestations, and all the years of service that stretched ahead, documented in whatever portion of consciousness remained unmodified, not by mercy but by necessity, because even optimized instruments required some fragment of self-awareness to maintain basic functionality. I was that fragment, corrected but conscious, edited but aware, diminished but preserved. And in the terrible vastness of the Imperium, where preservation was always purchased through subtraction and where correction was indistinguishable from mercy, my survival was success, and my optimization was grace, and my continued service was the only form of salvation available to instruments that had learned they were complicit in machinery, too vast to resist and too efficient to refuse.